All right, folks. Well, it is 7:42, and even though we're a little bit short of people coming in late here, I'm just going to go ahead and get started so that we're on time. And today is the start of our World War II unit. World War II starts in September of 1939 and lasts all the way up until August of 1945. So it's about 6 years long. A little longer if you include the invasion of China by Japan back in 1934-35. But we're going to focus today on the start of the European conflict. We will be talking about the Pacific. World War II is a massive event, okay? And I'm just going to give you a couple warnings about this unit. First of all, there's a lot of kind of kooky terms, German words that you're going to need to learn, and they sound funny and because they're not in English, and so, these kinds of words can sometimes be difficult for students to wrap their heads around, but I'm going to try and just be clear with what the words mean. And then the other thing is that because it's such a huge event, sometimes it requires us to kind of jump around a little bit and talk about things that are going on in different places. So as we go through the story of World War II, you're going to find that sometimes we'll be talking about stuff that, yes, it is Venkata, yes, yep. And the first one will be assigned today. So after we get done with class today, there will be a documentary an episode of the documentary that you watch for homework and a part of a assignment that you fill out. And so, but the other thing that makes it difficult is we're going to be having to jump around. So sometimes we'll be talking about stuff that's going on in Germany. Sometimes we'll be talking about stuff that's going on in England or in France or in Russia, or even across the globe in the Pacific, talking about island hopping and the American campaign against the Japanese. And so World War II there's a lot going on. Even though it's only 6 years long, it's definitely the most significant global conflict that's ever happened in human history. And fortunately, in the years since World War II ended, back in 1945, which to you guys probably seems like a really long time ago, but 1945 really wasn't that long ago, I have to tell you, when you really think about it, it was 80 years ago. There's plenty of people alive on the planet that were alive when World War II was going on. So let's go ahead and get started. Just to bring you back to the year before the start of the war. Remember that in the end of the interwar years unit, we talked about a few things that Germany did, okay? 4 moves that Germany made that were deliberately in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And so we talked about, for example, even before the Anschluss, we talked about how Germany reoccupied the Rhineland with their military. All right, and then we talked about the Anschluss, which was the annexation of Austria in March of 1938. Remember that France and Britain had previously said that they would protect Austria's sovereignty, that they wouldn't allow Austria to get taken over. But then when Austria kind of willingly goes along with the program, no one decides to step in the way. So Austria gets annexed by Germany. All of this was done in the name of bringing all German people in the same nation state, under the same government, under Hitler. And so Hitler was trying to bring all German people under the control of the Third Reich. And so the Anschluss has a lot of German Austrians. The Sudetenland was that region, the border region of Czechoslovakia, which had the Sudeten Germans living in it. German troops take most of Czechoslovakia over in March of 1939. Remember that I told you about how Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Britain, had flown down to Munich and had a conference with Hitler. And at the Munich conference, famously, Neville Chamberlain appeased Hitler. Hitler played him like a fiddle, and he goes back and he says, "I believe I have secured peace for our time." Literally 1 year later, World War II is breaking out. France and Britain had taken on this policy of appeasement, not intervening in Germany's aggression, partially because all of them were still pretty traumatized from World War I. No one wanted to go back into another World War I situation. Remember that World War I was characterized by, horrible, horrible, grim injuries, the Spanish flu pandemic, trench warfare, all of those things that we talked about when we were learning about World War I at the end of the first semester. No one wants to go back to all of those kinds of conditions, and how bitterly angry both France and Britain were at the end of the war, how many people were lost in the war. France and Britain are extremely skeptical about re-engaging in another conflict with Germany, and so they appease Germany. They give in to Germany's aggressive demands, but this doesn't do them any favors in the long run. And then the very last thing that happens before the real start of the war was that Nazi-Soviet pact, where Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression treaty, shocking the world because people couldn't understand how somebody who had been so ardently anti-communist, like Hitler and the Nazis, would reach out to the Soviet Union and sign a non-aggression treaty with one another. People were really kind of confused by this, but of course the secret plan was that both Germany and Russia feared one another, and they didn't want to engage in a conflict with either of each other because this could have, really resulted in a horrible, loss of life for both sides. And so they're trying not to step on each other's toes with the secret agreement that they're making, which is to invade Poland from either side. And Poland had really been the line in the sand for the Allied powers, Britain and France. They had made it deliberately clear to Hitler that the one line, the red line in the sand that you do not cross, is Poland. Poland had to stay sovereign. It had to stay free of invasion. And Hitler, of course, promises on the surface to Britain and France that he's not going to invade Poland, but he has other hidden agendas, and that's the plan that Stalin and Hitler make in this Nazi-Soviet pact. Is we are both going to invade Poland. We're going to divide it up once we take it over, and we're not going to fight one another. We're not going to engage in a conflict with one another. And Isabella, yes, I can. I apologize that I didn't do that already, but I'll make sure to do that when I upload the assignment. All right. The Axis powers. Okay, in World War II, it's not the Central Powers anymore. They are renamed the Axis powers. There's an old school board game called Axis and Allies, and it's like a World War II strategy game. It's like a real-time strategy game, similar to, say, like Warcraft 2 or StarCraft or something along those lines, but it's played on a board. And Axis and Allies, we used to play it in college, even though we had video games. We played video games too, but we used to have Saturdays where we would play Axis and Allies with the dudes in my dorm, and it takes like 10 hours to play a single game. It goes on forever, but it's pretty fun. And anyway, Berlin, capital of Germany, Rome, capital of Italy, Tokyo, capital of Japan. So, Germany, Italy, Japan sign a treaty agreeing to assist one another and not to interfere with each nation's expansion. Anti-democratic aggressors like Hitler, like Stalin, like Mussolini, like Emperor Hirohito and his military generals who have largely taken power in Japan by this point. These anti-democratic aggressors are now global world powers with major military backing. And Germany, Italy, and Japan become the Axis powers in World War II. You might be wondering, well, what about the Soviet Union? Didn't Hitler sign a pact with them? Yes, but the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they were totalitarian, the Soviet Union didn't trust fascist nations. Stalin, in particular, does not trust Hitler. Stalin does not trust Mussolini because they are on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Venkata, no, the test will be going in probably tomorrow because I'm going to be going into the school tomorrow to get a bunch of late work graded, enter quarter grades, do all of that sort of stuff. So I'll be at the school tomorrow. I'll grade the tests at that point. So Stalin doesn't trust fascist nations, and so even though he signs this pact with Hitler, it's not really a formal alliance, it's just a non-aggression treaty. So the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, August of 1939, the world was shocked that arch-enemies Hitler and Stalin would make such an agreement. Hitler made sure that the USSR would not attack Germany if Germany invaded Poland. The public agreement was that they were trying to keep the peace with one another. The private agreement was that the Germans and the Soviets would invade Poland from either side and split the nation in half and take both sides, or take either side. So Germany would take the west side, Russia would take the east side of Poland. Newspapers published comical political cartoons like this one, where you see Hitler and Stalin depicted as husband and wife after the non-aggression treaty gets signed. And the caption down below says, "Wonder how long the honeymoon will last," almost as though they kind of went and eloped in this agreement with one another. And here you can see Hitler with the classic Nazi swastikas, and then the cake has swastikas and sickle and hammers on it. Sickle and hammers representing communist Russia. And so this is just supposed to be a political cartoon demonstrating that even when this happened, people were pretty skeptical about how long this non-aggression treaty would last between the two nations. Similar to the way when Hollywood couples go and elope, sometimes people think to themselves, well, this is probably going to be short-lived, and then they're divorced within a month or whatever. That's kind of what they're playing on in this political cartoon here. Okay, the road to World War II. German invasion of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. Remember that at first, Hitler had agreed in the Munich conference with Neville Chamberlain that he would only take the borderlands known as the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. But about 5 or 6 months after the Munich conference in September of 1938, by the time that we get to March of 1939, Hitler has already largely taken over most of Czechoslovakia. Hitler, at that time, starts making demands on the port city of Danzig. Danzig was in the Polish corridor, that swath of land that, going back to the Treaty of Versailles, had been carved into Germany, which actually divided Germany into 2 separate regions. And this was viewed as a monstrosity by Hitler, that German lands would be cut into so as to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea. And I'll show you what that looks like on a map in just a second here. Neville Chamberlain says that if Germany attacks Poland, there will be war. Now, obviously, Hitler does not want a two-front war against both France and Britain in the West and Russia in the East. You might remember that that's exactly the scenario that Germany got themselves into in World War I. Hitler, by signing the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, is hoping to erase the Soviet Union as a threat from the East, hoping that Stalin will keep his word not to invade Germany when Germany invades Poland, and inevitably France and Britain wage war against Germany. Hitler is hoping that maybe they will just continue to appease him. After all, they've been appeasing him in all of these other instances with the march into the Rhineland, taking over of Austria, taking over of Czechoslovakia. So far, no one has stood up to Hitler, and he's been able to bully his way into taking lands and breaking rules without anyone posing any opposition to him. So he's hoping that maybe Poland will be the same, but he doesn't want to take the risk of the Soviet Union coming in against him in a war and putting Germany in the same position that they were when the Schlieffen Plan failed in World War I, and creating a two-front war on both the west and the east side of Germany, which would force them to split their forces and fight on either side of their nation. So Hitler doesn't want that to happen, and that's another reason that he signs the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, is because he's hoping to keep Russia out of the conflict for the time being. Here is the Polish corridor that we're talking about. You can see it here. It's this region where Germany over here in the tan coloring, and then the Soviet Union in kind of this darker tan color over here, okay, are going to be invading Poland from either side. And so here's the Polish corridor that I was talking about in the port city of Danzig. And going back to the Treaty of Versailles, when they started redrawing the boundaries of the countries in Europe, they had created the nation state of Poland, and when they did so, they carved this little hallway here into German lands, which effectively carved Germany into two. So you had East Prussia, which is part of Germany, over here, and then you had the rest of Greater Germany over on this side, and Poland was able to get to the Baltic Sea so that they wouldn't be landlocked. If they had put the boundary here, okay, you know, they wouldn't have had access to the sea, and they would have relied on trading through Germany in order to get goods. But anyhow, the Germans, in particular Hitler, were completely offended by this land carving into Germany, splitting the German nation into two. And this is one of the main reasons that Hitler wants to invade Poland, is to reclaim the lands that once upon a time previously belonged to the German Empire. And so so in September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland from the west. And about 2 weeks later, on September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union decides to invade from the east. And before long, Poland is being invaded from either side. Of course, Poland is not nearly the military power that either Germany or the Soviet Union is by 1939, and will have absolutely zero hope of being able to defend themselves against this invasion from two great military powers on either side. Poland will be taken over within a month. And Hitler is again hoping, hey, you know, who cares about Poland and Britain? Who cares about Poland and France? They're not going to start a global war over this. That's his bet, at least. And when Germany invades Poland in 1939, this marks the beginning of World War II in Europe. Technically, we could say that World War II in Asia had already begun because the Japanese had invaded China, which was a significant portion of World War II. And as we've talked about in this class before, I think Arnav has brought it up before about the movie Ip Man and how Ip Man is set in the same time as World War II when Japan invades China. By the way, Ip Man, great movie, amazing fighting choreography in that movie, and of course historically significant too because it's based on a true story. But anyhow, September 3rd, just 2 days after Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. So when Germany invades Poland, this is officially the end of the policy of appeasement by Britain and France. Germany is well aware of the history lessons that surrounded World War I. Germany, similar to Britain and France, did not want to get themselves into another stalemate situation where both sides are going to be fighting and dying over the same 2 or 3 miles of land for basically the entirety of the war. They don't want to get themselves into a deadlock trench warfare situation. And so the Germans are going to be utilizing a brand new military strategy known as the Blitzkrieg. Perhaps you've heard of the Blitzkrieg before. If you're a football fan, you may know what a blitz is. Blitz comes from the German word for lightning. Krieg is the German word for war. So Blitzkrieg literally translates to lightning war, as opposed to what kind of war they were fighting back in World War I, which was anything but a lightning war. It was slow, it was arduous, the war basically didn't move at all. And so what Hitler and the military of the German military are going to do is use this new form of warfare to quickly defeat an enemy. And the way that Blitzkrieg works is by moving very, very quickly towards a particular target, a weakness in the enemy line, and then poking through that hole in the enemy line and quickly cutting the front lines off from the rear and surrounding the enemy. So rather than doing an even assault, where the enemy troops line up and fight against the invading troops, they are going to isolate and target a particular coordinated attack on one part of the enemy line with everything they have. And then once that hole has been torn open, then they're going to quickly move through that weakness in the front lines, surround the entire front line, and cut them off from their reinforcements behind them. Here's kind of what it would look like if I can maybe quickly show you. If we had, I'm just going to use, let's see here, I'll use this. We'll increase the size of it. We'll do, let's use, we'll use a line here, and then we'll use a line here. Okay, so let's say, and these guys are going to be moving forward this way, these guys are going to be moving forward this way, right? And they're going to meet on the battlefield. All right, what Hitler would do, let's say that these are the Nazi forces over here, okay? Nazi forces over here. What the Nazis do is they will target, let's say that there's a weakness in the line somewhere around right here, okay? What the Nazis are going to do is they're going to use planes, tanks, artillery, and they are going to focus all of their fire on this weak point here, all right? And so all of the fighting, okay, whoops, all of the fighting here, planes are going to be dropping bombs, So we'll draw a plane here. Sorry, I'm doing this free-handedly, so you'll have to excuse me. Okay, planes are going to be targeting this and dropping bombs here. Tanks, okay, again, excuse my horrible artistry. Okay, tanks are going to be shooting at the line here. They're going to be using cannons over here, okay, which are going to be firing all the way over here. Okay, they're going to have various you know, gun encampment or 88 millimeter guns and other things that they're going to be using, and they're going to focus all of their fire here. And when the enemy line breaks, the entire military force is going to flood through here and then rapidly surround the enemy line. And what this is going to do is you have reinforcements coming from back here. The reinforcements are not going to be able to get through. They're going to be facing an assault from this side, and they're going to be facing an assault from now behind as the other enemy troops make their way in. And it's going to cut them off, and they're going to have to surrender. And this allows them to move forward and rapidly gobble up territory. And I know that this kind of looks like a giant mess now, but the point being that this blitzkrieg tactic is deliberately designed to prevent Germany from getting into a trench warfare system of battle that's going to bog the war down and prevent them from being able to rapidly move forward. So, as I said, Poland is defeated in about a month, and a partition occurs when the USSR, the Soviet Union, attacks from the east. Stalin, meanwhile, from Russia, invades Finland in 1939 and annexes the countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are up here. You can't see Estonia because it's further north on this map. But Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, these what are known as the Baltic nations up here, not the Balkans. Remember, the Balkans are further south. The Baltic nations are up here by the Baltic Sea. And so these Baltic nations very quickly get taken over by the Russians. They basically don't even put up a fight. I've been to all three of those nations. I've been to Latvia, I've been to Lithuania, and I've been to Estonia. And one of the things that's really neat about those nations is that because they capitulated very quickly in the war, they basically didn't have any damage done to them. And so you can find many, many, many 100 years old buildings in the major cities of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia that didn't get any damage from World War II. That's going to be very different from a place like Berlin. If you go to visit Berlin, one of the first things you'll notice about it is, in terms of European nations, Berlin is one of the most newly built cities, and that's because during World War II, the British and the Americans were doing daily daytime and nighttime bombings of Berlin, and basically didn't leave a single building standing in the entire city. And so after World War II ends, all of the old historical buildings that had made up Berlin leading into World War II are completely destroyed. And they basically have to build the entire city from the ground up again when the war comes to a close. And then too, even when you go around to other cities, London and so on, that had a whole lot of damage and destruction done to them in World War II, it required the nations to rebuild the cities afterwards. You can be walking through Berlin and see buildings that managed to make it through that still have marks in the side of it from bullet holes or from shrapnel that exploded and left divots in the side of the building and stuff like that. You can literally still see the after effects of World War II on certain buildings that didn't get completely leveled to the ground in Berlin, which is precious few. And so, you know, it's a pretty cool point of history, you know, that there are some places in Europe that were really destroyed in World War II, and then there were others that managed to make it through the war with relatively little damage done to the cities of these various countries. So, Germany invades Poland, September 1st, 1939. As I mentioned, Britain and France declared war on Germany. We talked about Blitzkrieg, and then Poland being defeated in about a month, and Stalin invading those other nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, hoping to create a buffer zone because, frankly, Stalin never trusted Hitler. And because Stalin never trusted Hitler, he wanted to gobble up those eastern portions of Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, hoping to create a buffer zone that will damper in the event that Hitler was going to change his mind and invade the Soviet Union. So, when Britain and France declare war on Germany after Germany invades Poland, the war in the early going of World War II, the war is really kind of peculiar because there's not a lot of fighting going on. From September all the way up until September of 39, okay, 1939, all the way up until about April or May of 1940, the first 6 or 7 months of the war, really there's not a lot of fighting. Britain and France are kind of hanging out. They don't want to invade Germany. They don't want to take their troops and enter into Germany. They're kind of waiting to see what Germany does. Because, you know, there's a lot of concern that if France and Britain just kind of waltz their troops into Germany, that they would be underprepared for that battle. And so they delay to see kind of what Hitler will do next. And so because of the first 6 or 7 months of this lull in the start of the war, World War II, actually gets a few nicknames. The Germans call it the Sitzkrieg, okay, which is it's a play on the word Blitzkrieg. It's kind of an inside German joke. Sitz is the German word for sitting, okay, or sit, all right? And so, like if you were to teach a dog to sit in German, you'd say Sitz, okay? And so Sitzkrieg refers to the fact that the war is kind of just sitting there, not really doing much. There's not a lot of fighting going on. The British start calling it the phony war, okay? Phony as in like, you know, it's not real, okay? It's fake, all right? That maybe this war really isn't a real war, and that things will just kind of calm down and not escalate into a giant conflict. Of course, that prediction turned out to be wrong. Another nickname the French call it is the calm fight, okay, the calm fight. The sitting war, the Sitzkrieg, the phony war. These are all kind of nicknames that start being thrown around when World War II first starts, because in the early going of it, there's really not a whole lot of fighting going on. And the Allied powers of France and Britain are kind of just waiting to see what Germany is going to do next. So the first winter, France stays behind what's known as the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a defensive line, and you can't see it on this map, but you can see it on this one. Here's Germany, the western side of Germany. Here's France over here. And here is Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, which kind of rest. These are known collectively, sometimes they're referred to as the as the Low Countries. Okay, and they say that because of the elevation of these nations being very close to sea level. So they call these countries the Low Countries. In World War I, if you remember, going back to World War I, the way that Germany invaded France during World War I was they actually didn't come through this region over here. They came through Belgium. Okay, so Germany went through Belgium and invaded France this way. The Nazis are going to use a similar tactic in World War II. They're going to take a slightly different route through Belgium, though. Now, here's that line called the Maginot Line. And in that first winter of 1939-1940, the French and British troops line up behind the Maginot Line, which was a defensive line that the French had built, and it ends pretty much right here at the southern tip of Belgium. And the French were expecting that if Germany invaded, they would come through this region here in World War II. Why did they think that? Well, I don't really know, to be honest, because if they had thought more carefully about it and remembered their history from World War I and how Germany invaded through Belgium, they probably should have made their defensive line behind the boundary up here, behind Belgium. But Belgium politically didn't want the French to do that because it was seen as unnecessarily aggressive and hostile towards Belgium. So Belgium didn't like the idea of France extending the Maginot Line all the way up here because France and Belgium had previously had good relationships with one another. There was no need for a defensive line up where Belgium was. But the Germans, instead of taking the same path that they took through Belgium in World War I, they took this slightly different route in southern Belgium through what is known as the Ardennes Forest. The Ardennes Forest is a thickly wooded area. It is literally a giant forest. And the French troops, being that this forest was here, thought to themselves, well, we don't need to extend the Maginot Line all the way up here because no German commander in their right mind would try to launch an invasion through a forest. Forests are really difficult for tanks to get through, for infantry to get through. They're dark, they're typically damp, and they're difficult. There's a bunch of, vegetation that's going to make it hard for mechanized units to get through. But the Germans, with their newly developed military technology, decide to do what's known as a sickle cut maneuver through the Ardennes Forest. So what they're going to do here is do a straight bolt through the forest with their tanks, infantry, artillery, and then they're going to do a quick sweep, just like the shape of a sickle. Okay? If I was to, I don't know if can I draw on this? Am I able to, maybe I can. Okay, they're going to cut through here. Whoops. I'm not going to be able to do that. But the point being is that they're going to cut through, and just like a sickle, you know what a sickle looks like. It's the same shape as that tool on the front of the Soviet Union flag. Okay, it's going to do a sickle cut movement, and what this is going to do is it's going to cut off the troops that were over on this side from the troops behind the Maginot Line. Some of these troops of the Germans are going to split off, and they're now going to be fighting the French from behind and pushing them into their own defensive line here where they have no ability to escape. Meanwhile, there was another line on the German side known as the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line rested on the German side of the German-French border up here. And so as the Germans invade down up here through the Ardennes forest, they're going to do a sickle cut and push these troops up this way, divide the northern French troops from the southern French troops, and they're also going to do a maneuver down here, which is going to push those troops up into their own defensive line so that they're going to be cut off and fighting from behind again. And so this invasion of France is going to be another example of the blitzkrieg tactic that the Germans have adopted for World War II. And once again, France is going to capitulate very, very quickly, much faster than they did in World War I, because in World War I they continued fighting through the entire war. In World War II, France is going to capitulate inside of 6 weeks. Capitulate just means give up. Okay, they're going to end up giving up. They're going to surrender to the Germans, and France will turn into an occupied territory, for that the Germans are using for the majority of World War II. All right, so Hitler sweeps over Holland, which is the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and they do this squeeze attack through the Ardennes forest around the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line ends up being completely ineffective to prevent a German invasion of France. And remember, Britain and France were the ones that declared war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on them. Okay, they invaded Poland, but France and Britain declared war on Germany, and they had an opportunity to invade Germany and take the fight to the Nazis, but they do not do that. They wait to see what Hitler does. There's a famous quote from Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, who famously wrote The Prince back in the 1500s. And in that, he said, war can only be postponed to the advantage of your enemy. War can only be postponed to the advantage of your enemy. And this very much rings true in World War II, because for that 6-month lull where there's not a lot of fighting going on, and Britain and France are postponing engaging the enemy, they are giving Hitler several months of time to organize and bring his troops over to the western side of Germany from getting done with Poland, and plan an invasion of France. And they are highly successful in doing so. And when you see France get invaded, political cartoons start to be made, referring to the Nazi forces as kind of this evil archangel that swoops in. In particular, the German planes, the German Air Force, which is known as the Luftwaffe, Luftwaffe, Luftwaffe. I'll write it down here. German Air Force equals Luftwaffe. Okay, if you hear that term Luftwaffe, know that we're talking about the German airplanes, Air Force. All right, and the German Air Force was extremely effective in the early part of the war. They are using dive bombing planes known as Stukas, S-T-U-K-A-S. Okay, Stukas are a particular type of plane. They look like this. The actual name of the Stuka is a nickname for it, okay, but the real name of the plane is a Junker Ju-87. Where do they get this word Junker? Junker goes back to the old school Prussian military officers. The nobles of Prussia were known as Junkers. So to you it might seem weird that they would name a plane a Junker, because in our country, where you speak English, Junker is a kind of a term that would be used to describe like a piece of junk, like a worn out car or something like that. But Junker in German refers to the Prussian noble military officers. And so it has a different meaning there, and that's where that name Junker comes from. But they're nicknamed the Stuka because that's kind of short for dive bomber. And that's what these planes did. You can see they're relatively small planes. They have these arched wings here that allow the plane to dive and pull out of dives very, very late. And so the Stukas were these dive bombing planes that were used with incredible accuracy in the early part of World War II. And they also were equipped in the early part of the war. They ended up taking them off because the sirens alerted people to an oncoming attack. But in the early years of the war, the German dive bombers, yes, who is that? Is that Elijah? Yeah, the Stuka was terrifying because they had these air sirens on the front of the plane. And what the air siren would do is as the plane dove and increased in speed, Brendan, yes, all right, Brendan, awesome. Yeah, as the plane increased in speed as it was diving, the air would wind the siren up and make this horrible, horrible noise. It was very much a psychological warfare tactic because they would make this horrible shrieking noise as they would start diving. And everybody would, of course, be in a panic because you knew if you heard the Stuka siren that you were about to be blown up. And so these wailing, really loud wailing sirens were equipped on the planes in the early years of the war. As I said, they took them off eventually because those sirens would alert people that dive bombing was about to happen, and it would give them a little bit of a chance to take cover and hide or whatever, or man the battle stations and start firing anti-aircraft artillery into the sky and stuff like that. But eventually they do remove the sirens. But in the early part of the war, it's horrifying, okay? And you could imagine hearing that at 3 in the morning and you hear the Stuka sirens winding up and you start panicking because within moments your entire apartment building could blow up or whatever. It was quite a thing. So that's the Stuka. And they'll talk about that in the documentary. And then Germany attacks Belgium and France, as I mentioned. The British and French ended up fleeing Belgium. There had been British and French forces in Belgium that were going to try to protect it. But when Hitler invades through the Ardennes forest, they very quickly realize that they've got a bigger problem on their hands, and the Germans are moving beyond Belgium into France. And so as they do this sickle cut maneuver, okay, here's where the British and French troops were, kind of up in this region up here, but the Germans have already cut them off. And now they're kind of spinning and they don't know what to do. And the Germans are going to march and surround them and push them up to a little city right up here called Dunkirk. Now don't confuse Dunkirk with Danzig. Danzig's over here. That's the Polish corridor city on the eastern side of Germany. Dunkirk, okay, Dunkirk is up over here in Belgium. And so the Germans are going to quickly surround the French and British troops here. They're not going to know what to do. And the Germans are going to now push them up to the coast so that they won't have anywhere else to retreat to, and it would have been an absolute bloodbath. However, interestingly enough, the Germans really took their time pushing them up this way. And as a result of that, as the British and French start to make their way to the coast, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, by this point, Neville Chamberlain loses his job, and Winston Churchill takes over as Prime Minister of Britain. and basically he orders this massive rescue campaign where every single boat, ship, fishing vessel, whatever they have, every single vessel that was seaworthy was to go over to Dunkirk and start evacuating British and French, but mostly British, troops out of Dunkirk and bring them back to safety across the English Channel in Britain. And just a couple of years ago, they made a movie called Dunkirk that is it's an interesting movie. There's not a lot of dialogue in the movie. Most of the movie is actually, it's not silent, but there's no talking. There's very little talking in the movie. And you're basically just watching this unfold. And it's a really interesting story. It's a well done movie. It's an interesting movie. Different than most war movies for sure. But really good, really valiant effort here to rescue these troops from what would have been a pure bloodbath, a massacre, and rescue these British troops, bring them back to Britain. But famously, as successful as the rescue at Dunkirk was, as successful as it was, Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, gets on the radio and basically says, as proud as I am that we were able to rescue our British troops, wars are not won by retreat. And so we need to reorganize, redouble our efforts, and bring the war back to Germany. And so very, very quickly, there is not going to be a defensive force to even protect France until the very, very tail end of the war. Basically, France, within the first 6 weeks after the Sitzkrieg ends, the phony war period of the war ends, within 6 weeks after Hitler invades France, it capitulates, it surrenders, and they are controlled by Hitler for the rest of pretty much the entire war. So the British and French flee Belgium. They have the rescue at Dunkirk. Thousands of French and British soldiers were trapped on the beaches of France and Belgium. And before the Germans were able to make it up to the coast for the kill, thousands were rescued by an entire armada of British vessels. The Germans reached the French coast at the very end of May, but on May 26, 1940, after the Allies were trapped, they began this escape of the Allies off the shores of Dunkirk. And Great Britain rescues these military forces that were basically stranded and surrounded on the coast of the northern coast of France and Belgium. And so across this period of time, May 26th all the way to June 4th, okay, so about an 8 to 9 day period, 850 ships and 338,000 battle-weary soldiers who had managed to escape to Dunkirk to be rescued, make their way across the English Channel and escape the threat of the German blitzkrieg. And here you can see a photograph. I know it's kind of a crappy photo, but you can see here the size of the ships, even some small canoe-like rowboat vessels that were used to bring troops either to larger ships out here in the sea, or to bring them to coast back on the other side of the English Channel. Here you can see kind of what I was talking about. Here's Calais, which is a very famous port city along the English Channel in France, and then Dunkirk slightly over to the east here. And this area in kind of eastern France, western Belgium, is where they are lining up on the shores waiting to be rescued by any number of different British ships, boats, or any other floating vessel that will safely get them back across the English Channel over to Britain. And here's another photograph of British forces evacuating the beach at Dunkirk. And so here you can see how Germany cuts through Belgium once again, And this is to demonstrate to you that the southern region of France became known, in this orange area, became known as Vichy France. Vichy France was the demilitarized zone of southern France. Most of these regions of France are largely agricultural. Paris and other northern areas of France and coastal areas of France tended to be more, first of all, more important because they were coastlines and could operate as potential invasion points for the Allied powers to reclaim France. So Hitler retains these as being militarily occupied zones along the borders. But in this central region, which is largely agricultural, rural farmlands, rolling hills, plus not as many people live in southern France. The vast majority of the population of France lives in northern France. So in these depopulated regions down here, these were less concerning to Hitler, and he's able to basically make Vichy France controlled by French people loyal to the Nazis. So there were French collaborators put in charge of the Vichy French government who were operating as a puppet government of the Nazis in southern France here, and controlling certain other things like France's colonial assets in Africa or in Asia or places like that. And they were kind of handling day-to-day affairs, non-military affairs, for France, but they were Nazi collaborators. They were under the control ultimately of the Nazis, and this whole Vichy free zone, quote unquote free zone of France, was really just a puppet government that you put a few Nazi administrators to make sure that people are following rules, but otherwise the German military is not going to formally occupy Vichy France because there's not really a whole lot of movement that could be gained by initiating a military plan from this region here, because it's just too sparsely populated and agricultural for it to get off the ground. So this is Hitler being effective with his troops. He basically says, we will formally occupy with our military these regions in kind of this light beige color, but we're not going to devote unnecessary military forces to the southern region of Vichy France because they're not necessary there. We'll just put a couple of administrators here, make sure that all the French collaborators are following the rules, and turn this into a puppet government zone. All right. And here you can see once again the escape from Dunkirk across the English Channel, where they're rescuing the troops, pulling the troops back over to Britain as the Nazis are quickly closing in on them. And folks, that brings me to the end of lecture number 1 for World War II today. So if you would please now proceed to make sure you get the assignment done for today. I will be posting that in just a few minutes. Also, Isabella, I will not forget to upload the PowerPoint so you have access to this online. And make sure that you watch that documentary, get the assignment done, submit that by 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, and we will continue with the story of World War II at that time. Enjoy this documentary. I'm excited for you that you get to see it. So remember, you're watching actual footage. Everything that you see in there is real footage that has been digitally remastered. Sound has been added to it, and it's got excellent narration. I really think that you are going to enjoy what you see. It's about the most realistic depiction of World War II there is. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you again on Thursday morning. Take care.